Thanks, Greg. Welcome to everyone who's joined the webinar. Thank you very much for your time. Hopefully you'll get quite a bit out of the webinar today, and in particular, I'm looking forward to the question and answer session. I'm sure that between Russell and myself, we'll be able to respond to as many of your questions as possible. If not, we've always got the ability through Greg and his team from Future Beef to take on board those questions and respond to you via a telephone call later or via email. So thanks again for joining. Just to provide a bit of background, the Fit to Load publication has been around for quite a while. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen there, the 2018 version. From memory, I think the first editions of the Fit to Load guide came out in about 2012. It's as a guide, it's one of MLA's most widely circulated publications, and I think from memory there's around 70,000 of that old version in circulation throughout Australia at the moment. So producers, livestock transporters, sale yard managers, a whole range of different people that work across the livestock industries and the livestock supply chain find that guide very, very valuable. As I've said, basically the guide's been developed to help livestock operators meet the Australian animal welfare standards and the guidelines for the land transport of livestock. For this particular version or edition, MLA started a process to review the document in about June last year, and we contacted 44 organisations around Australia. So a number of those organisations, obviously organisations such as Cattle Council of Australia, Sheep Producers Association, AWI, Australian Livestock and Property Agents Association, Australian Livestock and Rural Transporters Association. We also had, excuse me, RSPCA and Animals Angels heavily involved in producing the version that we'll talk about today. Of the organisations that were invited to contribute, we ended up with responses and feedback into the document from about 22 of those. And you'll see from the endorsements at the bottom of the guide on that first page there, just who has actually been involved in and endorsed the guide. Okay, so just a bit of background. Why does animal welfare matter? Well, the reality is that the livelihood of producers depends on producing healthy and content livestock. People that have been within the industry for quite some period of time would have known and seen the impact of the live export ban in 2011, and more recently the high profile nature of what we call, I guess, the ship of shame, live export of sheep out of Fremantle earlier this year. So basically animal welfare and how the industry treats and looks after their livestock are very, very matters of interest to not only the community, but also the consumers of red meat products. And if we basically do that, we're ignoring our responsibility not only to the animals, but we're placing our industry in jeopardy. So what's different in this edition compared to the 2018 edition that many of you would have? So basically, this edition contains additional information on clear roles and responsibilities for consignors and transporters. There's also a section on managing effluent, and I know Russell as a transporter will actually talk to that later on. You know, we've got a lot of, obviously, because of meat processing facilities and sale yards located in, you know, in our regional centres, we see a lot of transport vehicles moving in and out of those towns and regional centres every day. So, and Russell will speak to that a little bit more later on. A couple of other things that are basically new and updated in this version of the guide are some information around loading densities, the transport of bobby calves, the use of a firearm or a captive bolt for euthanizing animals, and clear checklists to help consignors of animals assess whether an animal is actually fit to load. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, you can see a table down there in the left-hand corner. Now, the main thing to take note of here is at what point is a person in charge of animals. And under chain of responsibility legislation, obviously throughout the transport or the journey of that animal from the point of origin to its destination, it's likely that that chain of responsibility and the person in charge of those animals could change a number of times, particularly if the animal is going through a sale yard. So from a producer or a consignor's perspective, basically they're responsible for the animal prior to loading, and in some cases up to the point of loading until the transporter probably shuts the slide gate and the animals are put onto the vehicle and secured on the vehicle. The transporter and the driver are basically responsible for loading, unloading, and responsible for the welfare of the animals during the journey. And then it's the receiver's responsibility to look after that animal after unloading. And as I said, that could be a meat processor, it could be a livestock agent, it could be a sale yard manager or superintendent. So just to reaffirm there, the producer or consignor is responsible for the mustering and handling of those animals and declaring that they're actually fit for the intended journey. And that's what this guide is seeking to do, provide a little more advice and a little more guidance around that. They're also responsible for providing feed and water prior to loading, providing advice to the transporter on the fitness of the animals, because the transporter in a lot of cases is going to turn up there and they won't have seen those animals before, whereas the consignor or the producer will hopefully mustered the animals and put them in the yard, so they've been able to eyeball those animals across a period of either hours, and should have a pretty good handle on which of those animals and the condition of those animals and such that they'll be able to make the journey to the point of destination. And the other important thing there basically is that the consignor of those animals is responsible for completing the necessary transport documentation. And one of the other new components to the guide is around transporting bobby calves. There's a few key points there in that you can't consign a bobby calf across Bass Strait. You can't use a dog or an electric potter on calves as well. You can't throw, drop or hit or drag a calf, and you can't lift an animal off the ground by the head, neck, ears, tail or a single leg. This information was contributed to the guide and is basically reflects information from Dairy Australia around bobby calves as well. So we've got consistency across the guide with the information that's being provided by Dairy Australia. A new section in the guide, as you can see from this slide, is around using firearms and captive bolts. So there's some recommendations there. So for euthanasing of adult cattle, where there's a recommendation there that the minimum calibre is a 22 Magnum. For goats and sheep, it's a 22 calibre. And just there's a couple of points there about being able to confirm death. So after you've either euthanased the animal using a firearm or a captive bolt, you actually take some time to confirm that the animal has actually died, and you're able to do that by checking if the pupil's dilated or the absence of the corneal blink. And then obviously one of the main ones there is that the animal's no longer respirating. In the case whereby the euthanasia hasn't occurred and the animal returns to respiration, well then obviously you would use the captive bolt again and or the firearm. Okay, a new section as well, as I alluded to initially, was in the introduction to the session, was around managing effluent. So for producers play an important role in actually reducing the amount of effluent that's created by animals on livestock vehicles, and that's why we've included this section in the fit to load guide. So the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator classifies effluent loss as a load restraint breach. So the poor old transporter driving through town, as I alluded to before, and as I said, Russell will talk on this a little bit more, is actually could be in breach of that piece of legislation if there's effluent discharged from the vehicle. So to try and reduce, obviously, the likelihood, I guess, or the risk of that occurring, producers can take steps to try and limit the amount of effluent that's produced. So one of the things there particularly is reducing access to lush green feed, and also if those animals have been on lush green feed, prior to mustering, well then there may be opportunity to provide some roughage to those animals to try and sort of bind them up a little bit. Obviously, access to water, provide access to water unless those animals are operating under a wet curfew. So the other thing about managing effluent is that not only is there a potential breach if that effluent leaves the livestock vehicle, but if there's excessive effluent in livestock crates, that effluent can actually cause animals to slip and injure themselves. And once an animal goes down on a truck, they can be stepped on, they can have broken legs, limbs can go out through the sides of the livestock crates. So there's a whole range of different things that by managing the amount of effluent produced, we're seeking to, reduce the likelihood that those animals are going to go down during the journey and injure themselves. So in terms of loading densities, there's a table within the guide that comes straight out of the Land Transport of Livestock Standard. Okay, so what we've done under each of those, within the standard, there's sections relevant to sheep, cattle and goats. We've actually condensed that or amalgamated that into the one table. So effectively what we're saying here is the transporter must ensure that the loading densities adhere to the standards and guidelines. And producers have a significant role to play in this. Obviously, if the transporter is saying during the point of loading, I've got enough on, I don't want to put any more on, well then it'd be very remiss of the producer to basically go and say, well, there's only 2 more, let's shove them on. Okay, so the poor old transporter has got the right of the last right of reply in terms of that. Okay, the other thing about loading density is that it must also account for things such as wool length on sheep. So very heavily wooled sheep or whatever obviously got a greater body mass, than sheep off shears, and also the presence of horns on both sheep and cattle. The size, the general size of an animal, and that's why you'll see within the guide that we basically, the loading density, are based on weight range. And the other thing there, account for weather conditions and the length of transport time. But also, if there are mothers with young at foot, you obviously need to give them a little bit more room as well. So getting into how to determine if an animal is fit to load. So this new version of the guide contains a checklist that can help people within the supply chain determine whether an animal is fit to load. So what we want to do is to ensure that the animal can walk on its own by bearing weight on all 4 legs. Now you think if you're a consignor of an animal and you put an animal on a truck, that's limping or that's lame or whatever, in my mind you're actually risky. You risk, or there is significant risk that an animal may not get to its journey in one piece. Okay, if it can't bear weight on all 4 legs. The next point there is ensuring that the animal is free from severe injury or distress. It's strong enough to make the journey and can see well enough to walk and travel to its point of destination. Okay, so it can't be blind in both eyes. Also, that the animal's not in late pregnancy or is basically too young to travel. Now, within the guide, we've actually stated that our preference is that animals that are going to have young have a lamb or a calf or a kid in the last 4 weeks of pregnancy are not to be transported unless they're done so under the advice of a veterinarian. And again, we're saying that the animal should have access to water prior to loading, unless they're operating under a curfew. So if there's any doubt about the fitness of the animal to make the journey, well, then leave it out. Don't put the animal at risk and potentially put the industry at risk by putting an animal on the truck. Essentially, if you do that, in my mind, essentially if you do that and you send the animal to a sale yard, then you're making it someone else's problem. Okay, so the next few slides are just showing some examples of animals that are unfit to load. So the first slide there on the left-hand side, sorry, the first picture shows a sheep with from memory, I think was a fresh dog bite. That animal shouldn't go on a truck. The animal should be treated, recovered from its injury before it's sent away to put on the truck again. Similarly, there's an abscess on the foot of that bull there, and the sheep on the right-hand side there is turned up at a sale yard with a broken leg, an old wound. Okay, those animals should never have got on the truck. Some other examples here: ingrown horns. We've got in the next picture there. We've got a sheep with what you would say would have to be a rather large hernia. We've got a cancer there on a ewe, and a ram with significantly enlarged testicles, and a dairy cow with advanced mastitis. Again, these animals, shouldn't have got on a vehicle and been transported. So some other examples here: a bull with a swollen pizzle turned up at a sale yard. There's a cow with a cancer or a lumpy jaw there. A dairy cow in full milk production with a full udder, and there's a sheep still in the paddock at this point, but obviously there's something wrong with it. Okay, so in my mind, you wouldn't pick that animal up and put him in the ute or whatever, and then take him and put him on the back of the truck. Okay, he's recumbent, lying on the ground. So find out what's wrong with the animal and then make appropriate treatment. If the animals, can't recover, well, then the kind thing to do would be to euthanize that animal. As I said, don't put it on the truck, send it to the point of destination, and make it someone else's problem. And then there's a bull there in the last photo that suffering from significant heat stress or another disease that's causing that animal to pant. So a range of eye diseases shown there. The first one there's an eye cancer as it's described, an animal with pink eye. Now the question has come up around pink eye before. How do you make a determination around that? I would say that if you've sold those animals privately to someone and that they're actually going on a truck from property A to property B, you let obviously the purchaser of those animals know that there is a animal with pink eye, and will they be happy to treat that animal when it gets to the point of destination? I wouldn't advocate obviously sending that animal to a sale yard simply because you'll have a buyer that will look to discount that animal at the first opportunity. So why not keep the animal at home and treat the eye disease and then send it in at a later date? We've already covered off on blindness in both eyes. If you do have animals that are blind in both eyes, don't put them on the truck and send them. Look to keep them at home and do something with them, around home. A couple of other examples of animals, and this is very topical at the moment with drought across much of Australia. Basically, do not transport animals that are emaciated, dehydrated or weak. And there's a guide there down in the bottom right-hand corner that will provide assistance around for consignors of animals about how to assess low body condition in cattle. So please avail yourself of that resource. The link to that document's there if you need to look at that. as I said, it's very topical at the moment. One of the things that we face with as an industry is around leaving an animal on a property if the property's in drought, and I guess my response to that is to try and determine if the animal is sufficiently strong enough to get to the point of destination. And if you don't believe that it is, well, obviously don't put it on the truck. Don't leave it to someone else again and make it someone else's responsibility. The last thing we want to do, obviously, is as an industry, is see a truck pull up at a sale yard, and a significant number of animals have to be dragged off the back of the truck, either to be euthanized and/or they're already dead. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. Well, entirely, actually. Sorry. So for people that actually want to avail themselves of that resource, and as I said, it's one of the most popular resources that MLA's got on its list of publications. You can go to the link at the bottom there, mla.com.au / is it fit to load, and you'll be able to actually order that publication or download it if you want to keep it on your device at home. We've also got a fit to load video that's available. This is based off the older guide, but over the next few months or whatever, MLA will actually look to update that. So keep a watch out for the updated version of that. But still within that, the older version of that video, principles are still the same. So just in terms of summary, what's different with this guide compared to the older guide? We've got clear roles and responsibilities for consignors and transporters. We've got clear guidelines for transporting of bobby calves, how to perform euthanasia correctly, how to manage effluent and reduce the amount of effluent that's created, I guess, while the animals are being transported. And also, while we're talking about transport, ensuring that we've got appropriate loading densities of the animals. So basically, the guide provides clear direction around what is and what is not fit to load. Okay, and there again, if in doubt, leave it out. Just one final word of, I guess, before I hand over to Russell to provide a bit of comment, I guess, from a producer and a transporter perspective, is that since the release of the guide, only just over a month or 6 weeks ago, MLA's been approached by the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator to start to develop information for transporters to ensure that they are aware of their responsibilities under legislation to ensure they meet their load limits during the transport of livestock. So it's highly likely that in future editions of the guide, there will be information contained in there about chain of responsibility again, and how the red meat sector can work together to meet load limits for vehicles transporting livestock. And that's obviously with prefaced on the fact that we need to ensure that livestock transport is being conducted in a safe manner, and that any breaches in heavy vehicle mass or whatever are not impacting other people using roads. So that's the end of my presentation and my section, and I'm happy to take some questions after Russell's section. But just in conclusion, what we're aiming to achieve through our animal welfare approaches is ensuring that what we do as an industry is transparent, that we're taking responsibility for our actions, that we're actually accountable for the actions that we do take, that we're operating with integrity, and that we're showing our consumers and our customers that what we're actually doing from an animal welfare perspective, is actually normal. Okay, so it's ensuring that they realise that there's normality in everything that we do. And there again, as I said, if there's any doubt about the the fitness of animals to reach their destination, don't put them on the truck. Leave them out. So I'd just like to invite Russell Lethbridge. Greg's introduced Russell, so I won't take up any more of your time. So Russell, happy to have your perspective, I guess, from a producer and/or a transporter about the importance of the Fit to Load guide.
Thanks, Ted. Thank you very much. I'll go ahead now, and great to see so many participants on this webinar here today, as the matter doesn't get much more serious than this, I don't believe. We always have to be mindful. There's just a couple of points I'd like to make. We must always be mindful that when those livestock transport vehicles get to the cities and towns, that becomes the face of our industry, and whether we like it or not, they know. And as just referring to a Beef Central article yesterday, where a councillor in Melbourne has decided he doesn't want livestock transport vehicles going through their main arterial roads because he doesn't want some effluent ending up on a tourist map. Whether we like it or not, that's where we're at. I obviously don't agree with that sort of thing, but it is the face of our industry. That's probably the most minimal thing that could happen, actually. If the wrong person with the wrong camera at the wrong time was to take some footage of some of the situations that I've seen and we've all seen, then our whole industry is at risk. So we have an obligation to ourselves and our entire industry to do everything we possibly can in preparing livestock and getting them to their destination in an animal friendly animal welfare environment. The big point I'd like to make from a producer's perspective is that the transporter operator turns up at our ramps in good faith that we've done everything in our power to make it possible for them to conduct the journey in a satisfactory manner. They have no idea of what's happened to those animals before they've pulled up at that ramp. And so look, so quite often when something goes wrong, it's absolutely nothing to do with the transport operator, mostly. It's what has happened in the preparation of those livestock prior to, that they are not privy to. So quite often we're setting them up where the situation is not ideal. And believe me, I'm not just dodging shadows here. There's a significant amount of animal welfare substandards going on in the industry. You've only got to speak to some sale yard receivers, abattoir stockmen on receiving livestock trucks, and there's enough going on for us all to be very concerned about. And quite often it's not always poor or weak condition animals. Sometimes these animals are prime, but they've just been prepared and set up wrongly. I've seen cases where animals that are freshly dehorned and castrated put on a truck for a 1,000-kilometre journey and to go through a clearing dip on the way. That sort of thing is just, I mean, that's about as bad as it gets. Obviously, at the end of that trip, they're dragging a lot of dead ones off. So this is all about planning. It's all about doing everything better along the way. Obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all. As far as the effluent goes, obviously, as soon as we start to capture effluent, we close in trucks, so we're creating another animal welfare issue with the heat in the north and that sort of thing. Well, heat everywhere and lack of ventilation. So there's a lot of work to be done there on the routes and things where effluent capture trucks are mandatory and that sort of thing. And as far as the NHVR goes on fatigue and welfare, TED, etc., have started the conversation around the transport of live animals. we just don't believe that live animals should be just treated like pallets of fertiliser. And there is things that go wrong in some trips where you might need another hour and that sort of thing. So look, it's those conversations have started, and we can, we're not asking to have huge breaches of the fatigue laws and that sort of thing, but we are asking for recognition that these are live animals we're transporting, not bags of cement. That's probably all I really had to say from my perspective, Ted. But it's an extremely serious matter, and I would hate to see the industry's reputation come under risk because of one of these situations that could have been avoided quite easily. Thanks, Ted.
Good on you, Russell. Thank you very much.